Stage and screen legend Julie Andrews, beloved for her performances in Mary Poppins and The Sound of Music, has taken on a different role in recent years, that of a children's book author.
Everyone thought Julie Andrews was too sweet to ever hate anyone. But Hollywood knew better. Behind that perfect smile and crystal voice was a grudge that never really died. She kept it quiet, but the tension between her and one woman in the industry was impossible to ignore. So who was the woman bold enough to get on Julie's bad side? Stick around to find out. Julie Andrews' tumultuous childhood. Everyone knew Julie Andrews as the embodiment of grace, the woman with the perfect poise, that crystal-clear voice, and the kind of sweetness you'd swear couldn't be faked. But long before she became Hollywood's darling, Julie's story started far from fairy tales and red carpets. It began in the middle of wartime England, in a home where love was complicated, tempers ran high, and music became both her escape and her saving grace. Julie Elizabeth Wells was born on October 1st, 1935, in Walton-on-Thames, Surrey. Her mother, Barbara Ward Wells, was a spirited woman with big dreams, and her father, Edward Charles Ted Wells, taught metalwork and woodwork for a living. But here's the twist. Julie's birth wasn't the result of that marriage. Years later, her mother would quietly confess that Julie was conceived during an affair with a family friend. It was a secret that Julie didn't learn until she was 15, a truth she carried in silence for decades until she finally revealed it in her 2008 autobiography. World War II tore the Wells family apart. Her parents divorced, both eventually remarrying. Barbara found a new husband, a performer named Ted Andrews, while Julie's father married a war widow. The chaos of the Blitz sent families scattering across England, and Julie was shuffled from one home to another. Her father worked helping evacuate children, while her mother entertained troops with her new husband. For a while, Julie lived with her dad in Surrey, but in 1940 he decided to send her to live with her mother and stepfather. He thought they could offer her a better artistic education. That decision would change her life, and not entirely for the better. At first, she called her stepfather Uncle Ted, a name that carried some safety and some distance. But her mother wanted her to start calling him Pop. Her real father, she said, should now just be Dad. Julie hated the change, and with time, her reasons became painfully clear. The family was broke, scraping by in what she would later describe as a bad slum area of London. Her stepfather drank heavily and had a violent streak. When he got drunk, he'd sometimes try to sneak into her room. Julie, terrified and cautious even as a young girl, installed a lock on her door. It was one of the first ways she learned to protect herself. But Ted Andrews wasn't the only one battling demons. Her mother, Barbara, struggled with alcoholism too. Julie loved her deeply, but in later years, she admitted that her mother's drinking meant she could never completely trust her. Still, in the middle of that chaos, there was music. As Barbara and Ted's stage careers began to pick up, they moved to better neighborhoods. First Beckenham, then Hersham, where they finally had a bit of stability. They moved into a house called the Old Mews, a modest place with family history. Julie's grandmother had once worked there as a maid. Ted Andrews may have been flawed, but he saw something extraordinary in his stepdaughter. He arranged singing lessons for her, starting with the Cone Ripman School, now Tring Park School for the Performing Arts, where Julie's formal training began. Then came the woman who would shape her future more than anyone else, Madame Lillian Stiles Allen, a concert soprano who became her vocal mentor and in many ways her third mother. Madame Stiles Allen recognized something rare the moment she heard Julie sing. She described her students' range, tone, and control as nothing short of astonishing, the kind of voice that didn't just hit notes but floated through them. Julie later joked that her 4-octave range was so piercing that dogs would come from miles around. Even as she downplayed her talent, her discipline was unmatched. Stiles Allen pushed her to masterpieces by Mozart and Rossini, instilling in her the kind of technique that would later define her career. By the time Julie reached her teenage years, she was already performing with the kind of confidence most adults couldn't fake. But her journey started much earlier and much humbler, making it big. By the time the world came to know Julie Andrews as Mary Poppins, the practically perfect woman who could charm birds out of the sky, her rise to fame had already been a lifetime in the making. What most people didn't know was that the woman who sang A Spoonful of Sugar had spent her childhood scraping by on wartime stages, learning early that applause could fill more than just theaters. It could fill empty stomachs and heal broken spirits. Julie's path to stardom didn't begin with glamorous auditions or Hollywood connections. It began with beer crates and makeshift microphones. Around 1945, she was barely 10 when she started performing with her mother and stepfather. The shows were small, but to her, those audiences felt like Broadway. She recalled being told to nap one afternoon because she'd be allowed to sing that night. That moment, tiny as it was, marked the start of something bigger. From then on, she sang duets with her mother and stepfather, learning rhythm and poise. She later joked about how ghastly those early performances must have sounded, but audiences loved her energy and confidence. During those post-war years, she toured the UK performing for soldiers. Petula Clark remembered the two of them traveling by train, sleeping in luggage racks, and performing for the troops. While most kids were hiding in bomb shelters, Julie was already learning how to command a stage. It wasn't a glamorous start, but it built her grit and showmanship. The turning point came when her stepfather introduced her to Val Parnell, a major entertainment executive who ran London's top venues. He saw something in the young girl with the golden voice, and at just 12, she made her professional solo debut at the London Hippodrome. She performed the famously difficult aria Je suis Titania from Mignon, a piece even adult sopranos avoided, and she nailed it. Overnight, she went from novelty act to rising star. Julie spent a year performing at the Hippodrome in Starlight Roof, where she played a cheeky little girl begging comedian Wally Boag for balloon animals. When she began to sing, the crowd went wild. She later remembered how the audience went crazy. It was the kind of moment that defines a performer for life. At 13, she became the youngest solo artist to perform at the Royal Variety Performance before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Imagine that. Barely a teenager, standing under the Palladium lights, her voice filling the Royal Hall. From that night on, everyone knew Julie Andrews was the real deal. Her rise continued through radio, pantomime, and early TV appearances on BBC shows. She played roles in Aladdin, Humpty Dumpty, and Cinderella, refining her craft. Even then, Julie wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing mastery. By the early 1950s, while most teens were figuring out who they wanted to be, Julie was already a professional, performing across the West End. She even lent her voice to an Italian animated film, The Singing Princess, her first taste of cinema. Then came 1954, the year that changed everything. Just before her 19th birthday, she made her Broadway debut in The Boyfriend. Recommended by actress Hattie Jacques, she took the role and crossed the Atlantic, nervous but determined. Her father encouraged her to take the leap, and it paid off. The show became a hit, and critics singled her out as its brightest star. Audiences fell in love with her charm and effortless voice. She didn't have to act sweet. It was simply who she was. Her next big opportunity came quickly. As The Boyfriend ended, she was invited to audition for Lerner and Loewe's new musical My Fair Lady. After 3 readings, she landed the lead role of Eliza Doolittle, the rough flower girl turned Lady of Grace. Julie felt an instant connection to Eliza's story of transformation, calling her a character I could understand completely. During rehearsals, director Moss Hart spent 48 hours coaching her one-on-one, breaking down every emotion until she became Eliza inside and out. Julie later described it as the greatest acting lesson she ever received. When My Fair Lady opened in 1956, it was a sensation. Critics adored her and audiences worshipped her. Overnight, Julie Andrews became Broadway royalty. Her success drew the attention of Richard Rodgers, who created Cinderella just for her. The live broadcast in 1957 drew over 100 million viewers, an audience unheard of at the time. Overnight, she became America's new sweetheart. Hollywood couldn't look away. Between 1956 and the early 1960s, she appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show and The Gary Moore Show, solidifying her fame. In 1960, She played Queen Guinevere in Camelot alongside Richard Burton and Robert Goulet. The production had its challenges, but Julie's elegance and voice carried it through. When My Fair Lady was adapted for film, everyone assumed she would reprise her role. She was Eliza, but studio head Jack Warner thought she wasn't movie star material and chose Audrey Hepburn instead. It was devastating. Julie had created that character from the ground up, and now it was being taken away just as she was about to break into Hollywood. But fate had other plans. Walt Disney had seen her in Camelot and knew she was perfect for his new film about a magical nanny. When he offered her Mary Poppins, Julie was pregnant and declined. Disney's response was simple: "We'll wait for you," and he did. After giving birth, Julie flew to Los Angeles to start filming. She poured herself into Mary Poppins, crafting every detail with precision and wit. The result was pure magic. The film became Disney's biggest hit, and Julie Andrews became a Hollywood icon overnight. She won both the Academy Award and Golden Globe for Best Actress. During her Golden Globe speech, she couldn't resist a graceful jab thanking a man who made all this possible, Mr. Jack Warner. It was poetic justice delivered with a smile. Then came the sound of music. At first, Julie thought it was rather saccharine, but once filming began in the hills of Austria, she fell in love with it. Her warmth and sincerity made the role of Maria unforgettable. The movie became the highest-grossing film of its year and sealed her place among Hollywood's greats. In the years that followed, Julie proved she wasn't a one-note star. From dramatic roles to TV specials, she kept reinventing herself. Her work carried a mix of grace, discipline, and quiet rebellion. She wasn't chasing fame anymore, she was building a legacy. Julie Andrews didn't just become famous, she became timeless. Her story isn't one of overnight stardom, but of strength, talent, and heart. From the beer crate stages of post-war Britain to the grand lights of Hollywood, she never stopped singing, and the world never stopped listening. The great loves of Julie Andrews' life. Julie Andrews has spent more than 6 decades as Hollywood's picture of grace. That angelic voice, the perfect poise, and the timeless charm that made her everyone's favorite governess and magical nanny. But while her career soared to legendary heights, her love life was far quieter, far more personal, and deeply human. Behind that polished exterior was a woman who loved fiercely, lost painfully, and never stopped believing in love, no matter how hard it got. At 90, Andrews has only ever loved 2 men, truly loved them. The first was Tony Walton, a gifted set and costume designer who helped bring some of Broadway and Hollywood's biggest productions to life. The second was director Blake Edwards, the man who turned out to be her ultimate match. A love that lasted more than 4 decades, right up until the day he died. Tony Walton came into Julie's life when they were barely teenagers. It was 1948, and she was just 11, performing in a Christmas pantomime called Humpty Dumpty at the George Hotel in Luton. Walton, 12 at the time, watched from the audience and was immediately taken by her. He reached out after the show, and what started as a simple exchange turned into a pen-pal friendship that lasted for years. By the time they reconnected as adults, that innocent bond had deepened into something far stronger. Over dinner one night at the Walton family home, the two shared a quiet moment that would change everything. As Andrews described in her memoir Home, they looked at each other, smiled, and without any grand gestures or fancy speeches whispered the same thought: they should get married. On May 10, 1959, they did. They were young, talented, and madly in love. Walton was quickly becoming a name in theater design, working on productions like Pippin and Guys and Dolls, while Andrews was carving her own path to stardom. By the time Walt Disney came knocking with Mary Poppins, Julie and Tony were practically a creative duo. She played the magical nanny, and he designed the costumes that brought the world of Cherry Tree Lane to life. Their love story also brought a daughter into the world, Emma Walton Hamilton, born November 27, 1962. Andrews adored motherhood, but balancing fame, a demanding schedule, and family life proved harder than she ever expected. "Marriage is a big up-and-down graph," she once told Vanity Fair. "It's a wondrous thing, but it's probably the hardest work I've ever done." The pressures built quietly but steadily. Between film shoots, theater deadlines, and long separations, cracks began to show. Andrews described that time as a struggle, Torn between her devotion to her husband and the all-consuming love she felt for her child, she wanted everyone to be happy, but the demands of fame and family began pulling her in opposite directions. By 1968, the marriage had reached its breaking point. Andrews later admitted to Stephen Colbert that she and her lovely first husband eventually had to separate. Her mind was cluttered, her heart exhausted. In her own words, "The worst of it was, you feel such a failure because it's certainly nothing that one anticipates going into a marriage." Still, Andrews and Walton never let heartbreak turn into bitterness. They stayed friends, real friends, the kind that lasted long after the ink on the divorce papers had dried. When Walton passed away in 2022, Andrews described him as her dearest and oldest friend. She spoke with deep affection, calling him a titan of the arts, and saying that he had taught her to see the world with fresh eyes. The respect between them had never faded. But even before that chapter had fully closed, fate was already writing her next one. In 1959, around the same time she first met Walton, Andrews had a brief encounter with a man named Blake Edwards, the sharp, sophisticated director best known for Breakfast at Tiffany's and The Pink Panther. She later described it as two ships that passed in the night. Years later, as if the universe was giving them a second chance, their paths crossed again, quite literally, outside their therapist's office. Andrews recalled driving one way while Edwards drove the other. He rolled down his window, flashed that witty grin, and asked, "Are you going where I just came from?" It was corny, but it worked. They grew close as Edwards directed her in Darling Lily in 1969. "It seemed dumb not to admit we were in love," Edwards told People years later. But their timing was complicated. Both were still technically married, both trying to navigate emotional wreckage from their pasts. When Edwards proposed, Andrews admitted she was completely caught off guard. They had only been seeing each other a little over a year. Still, she knew he was different. "He was the most charismatic and interesting fellow I'd ever met," she recalled. "I don't think I'll ever find anybody quite like him." 3 years later, they finally tied the knot. With Blake came 2 stepchildren, Jeffrey and Jennifer, and soon after, Julie and Blake adopted 2 daughters from Vietnam, Amy and Joanna. Their family grew quickly, beautifully, and a little chaotically. Life with Edwards was full of energy and humor. They split their time between Malibu and Gstaad, surrounded by love, art, and the occasional madness of the film industry. But through all the highs and lows, their marriage endured. Andrews often said the secret was simple: take it one day at a time. Their love wasn't just romantic, it was creative too. Edwards adored her talent, calling her the beautiful English broad with the incomparable soprano and the promiscuous language during his honorary Oscar speech in 2004. Andrews, in turn, often spoke glowingly of his brilliance as a director, saying she couldn't stress enough what a fine artist he was, and not just because she was married to him. When Edwards died of pneumonia in 2010, Andrews was by his side. She later described it as one of the hardest losses of her life. "They broke the mold when Blake was born," she reflected. "I hadn't come across anybody with his wit and sophistication, which I relied on a great deal. Even years later, the grief still catches her off guard. There are days when it's perfectly wonderful," she said, "and then suddenly it'll sock you in the middle of your gut, and you think, 'Ah, God, I wish he were here.' But he is in a way. I think one carries that love always." Julie Andrews' life reads like a cinematic masterpiece, one filled with music, heartbreak, reinvention, and love that outlasts time itself. She's the woman who taught generations to sing, but behind every song was a heart that knew how to break and heal again. As she once said of her marriage to Blake Edwards, "We were married 41 years, and it was a love story. It truly was." And yet, even after all the applause, all the awards, and all the memories that filled her storybook career, life still had one more cruel twist waiting for her. The very thing that had carried her from the small theaters of war-torn England to the grandest stages on earth, her voice, would one day turn against her. How Julie Andrews lost her singing voice. If you've ever heard Julie Andrews sing, really sing, you know it wasn't just a voice, it was something heavenly, like velvet and sunlight rolled into sound. From Mary Poppins to The Sound of Music. To her stage triumphs in Victor Victoria, her 4-octave range didn't just impress, it enchanted. But what most people don't know is that the same voice that made her a legend would one day betray her. and when it did, it nearly broke her. By the late 1990s, years of performing had begun to wear on her instrument. During her run in the Broadway version of Victor Victoria, Julie started struggling to hit notes that once came effortlessly. Doctors found what they described as a benign lesion, maybe a cyst, maybe a polyp, and recommended surgery. It was supposed to be simple, a quick fix. Her husband, Blake Edwards, and the show's production team wanted her back on stage for the touring company. Her doctor assured her the operation was safe. So in June 1997, at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, Julie Andrews, the woman whose voice had carried entire generations, signed the papers and went under the knife. But instead of fixing the problem, the procedure destroyed her voice. Scar tissue formed on her vocal cords, making them too stiff to vibrate properly. Overnight, her signature sound, that pure bell-like tone, was gone. When she spoke publicly in 1999, her words cut deep. "Singing has been a cherished gift, and my inability to sing has been a devastating blow." She filed a malpractice suit against the doctors and the hospital, claiming she was never warned of the risks. The case was settled the following year for a reported $30 million, though she's never confirmed the amount. But honestly, what's money compared to losing your voice? Still, Julie wasn't ready to fade into silence. She worked with renowned surgeon Stephen Zeitels, who performed multiple procedures to remove scar tissue and help her speak again. He managed to restore her speaking voice, but when he examined her cords, he found that much of her vocal tissue was simply gone. Her range, once spanning 4 glorious octaves, had been reduced to barely 1. She could manage low notes, but the middle and upper registers, the very heart of her voice, were lost. That realization could have ended her story. Instead, she turned it into a mission. Julie became an advocate for vocal health, supporting research and even serving as honorary chair for the Voice Health Institute. She wanted to help others protect what she had lost, but privately she was grieving. She sought counseling in Arizona, trying to make peace with the silence. In her memoir Home, she described what singing used to feel like. That blissful moment when the orchestra swells beneath you, the melody wraps around you, and every note feels like it was written just for you. That was what she had lost, not just a career, but a piece of her soul. And yet, true to form, Julie Andrews reinvented herself. If she couldn't use her singing voice, she would find another one. With her daughter Emma Walton Hamilton, she started writing children's books, stories full of heart, wonder, and music in their own way. When she asked Emma what kinds of books her young grandson would love, she realized they didn't exist, so she made them herself. With Emma and her ex-husband Tony Walton illustrating, the trio created over 30 beloved children's books, a whole new kind of performance, just on the page instead of the stage, and every now and then, she still let that voice peek through. In The Princess Diaries 2, director Gary Marshall convinced her to speak-sing a gentle duet with Raven-Symoné. It was the first time anyone had heard Julie sing in years, and when she did, Gary said even the tough guys on set got misty-eyed. Julie Andrews may have lost the sound that defined her, but she never lost her ability to move people. And maybe that is the real magic she always had. That was her gift, turning heartbreak into art and disappointment into dignity. Still, Hollywood wasn't always kind, even to someone as graceful as Julie. Before she learned to master silence, she'd learned what it felt like to be silenced not by surgery, but by Hollywood itself. Julie Andrews truly hated her. Everyone thought Julie Andrews was too sweet to ever hate anyone, but Hollywood Whispers told a different story. Behind that perfect posture and English charm was a wound that didn't heal easily. And it all began with one woman, a fellow screen darling whose grace matched hers note for note. The story of Julie Andrews and Audrey Hepburn isn't one of open rivalry, but of quiet hurt, stolen chances, and poetic justice that Hollywood couldn't have scripted better. It was the early 1960s, and My Fair Lady was the show everyone was talking about. Julie Andrews had brought Eliza Doolittle to life on Broadway, transforming from a Cockney flower girl into a poised London lady 8 times a week. Her voice, her humor, and her timing, it was perfection. Naturally, when word got out that My Fair Lady was being made into a film, everyone assumed Andrews would simply slide into the role that had made her a star. But Hollywood had other plans. At 30, Julie was a Broadway name, not a movie star, That distinction, at least to Warner Brothers boss Jack Warner, meant everything. Still, when he reportedly asked Andrews to come in for a screen test, she wasn't interested. After all, he had already seen her perform it live night after night. She allegedly told him, "You've seen me do the part, and you know I can do a good job." That confidence, though admirable, might have cost her everything. Warner publicly doubled down, saying he would only be considering established film stars for the role. That was when Audrey Hepburn, already adored for Breakfast at Tiffany's and Sabrina, entered the picture. Audrey had it all: elegance, fame, and that fragile beauty that camera lenses loved. Warner offered her an enormous $1 million for the role, a staggering sum at the time. He defended his choice, saying people recognized Audrey's name instantly and that, in his business, it was all about who could sell tickets. For Broadway fans, though, it felt like robbery. Julie had earned Eliza. Audrey had inherited her. Even Audrey herself wasn't fully at ease with the casting. In interviews, she admitted she understood the disappointment of audiences who had seen Julie on stage. She hadn't wanted to take the role at first because she knew it belonged to Andrews, but she realized that if she turned it down, another movie star would be offered the part anyway. So she took it, reluctantly, trying to honor the role rather than steal it. Then came the cruel twist. Audrey threw herself into the production, working 12-hour days to master the songs. But behind the scenes, director George Cukor and composer Andre Previn had already decided her voice wasn't strong enough for the musical numbers. They quietly brought in Marni Nixon, the same voice who had sung for Natalie Wood in West Side Story, to dub Audrey's singing. Audrey didn't know. When she finally found out, she was devastated. She feared the worst, that the world would see her as the woman who took Julie's role and couldn't even sing it. Previn would later recall how deeply the discovery wounded her. She never complained